Morning arrived softly in western Montana, the kind that felt untouched by urgency. Mist clung to the treetops, and the gravel road leading to the trailhead was still damp from the night's cold breath. She stepped out of the car just after sunrise, pulling her jacket tighter, unaware that this quiet moment would become a reference point for everyone who loved her. The forest stood open before her, vast, patient, and unreadable. She had been eager to walk alone. Not reckless, just restless. The mountains had always felt safer than people, more honest. She told them she'd be back by afternoon, that it was just a short hike, nothing difficult. Her voice had carried confidence, the kind adults trusted too easily. The car door closed. The engine faded, and the world narrowed to her footsteps pressing into soil and pine needles. The trailhead sign was old and splintered, its lettering softened by years of wind and snow. Beyond it, the path slipped quickly into shadow. Tall pines blocked the sun, and the air cooled within seconds. Birds moved overhead, unseen but close, their calls sharp and sudden. She walked deeper, breathing steady, unaware of how quickly familiar ground could turn deceptive. Hours later, the parking area remained unchanged. Her car still sat where it had been left, dust settling slowly on the windshield. At first, no one noticed. Time passed the way it always did, quietly, without warning. A delayed return was nothing unusual. Montana taught patience. It taught trust. By late afternoon, that patience began to thin. A phone call went unanswered. Then another. The forest, so generous with sound earlier, offered no response now. Concern crept in gently, disguising itself as reason. Maybe she'd taken a longer route. Maybe the signal was gone. Maybe she was still walking, unaware of the clock. As evening approached, the sky shifted colors, deep blues folding into gray. Shadows stretched across the trailhead, lengthening like fingers. Someone returned to check the area. They stood where she had stood, scanning the same tree line, calling her name into a space that absorbed sound without returning it. The echo they expected never came. The last confirmed sighting narrowed everything down to one simple fact: she had entered the forest alone. No witnesses beyond that point. No sounds of struggle. No sign of haste. Just an ordinary decision made under an ordinary sky. Night fell faster than expected. The temperature dropped, and the forest settled into a deeper stillness. The idea that she was out there, somewhere beyond the reach of headlights, began to feel heavy, uncomfortable, real. This was no longer about a late return. It was about absence. The trail headlights flickered on, illuminating nothing new. Her name was spoken again, louder this time, edged with fear. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wilderness waited, holding its secrets close. And as the final light faded from the sky, waiting quietly turned into something else entirely, something that would not let go by morning. Darkness did not bring sleep. It stretched the hours thin, turning minutes into something sharp and unmanageable. Inside the house, lights stayed on long past when they normally would have gone dark. Every sound felt amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a clock, the distant wind pressing against the windows. Waiting had become an activity, exhausting and relentless. Phones were checked again and again, even after logic said there was no signal where she'd gone. Each vibration sent a jolt through the room, followed immediately by disappointment. Her name was spoken in fragments of conversation, as if saying it whole might somehow make the fear real. They replayed the morning in pieces, searching for clues that hadn't mattered then. She had promised she'd be back before sunset. That promise echoed now, heavier with every passing hour. Someone insisted she was capable, that she'd probably found shelter and would walk out at first light. Another voice, quieter but persistent, wondered why she hadn't tried to return already. Hope and doubt took turns occupying the same space, neither strong enough to win. Outside, the forest lay unseen but felt everywhere. Montana nights were unforgiving, especially this time of year. Temperatures dropped quickly after dark, and the idea of her alone out there began to sharpen into panic. Jackets were pulled on and off again, restless energy having nowhere to go. Waiting felt like betrayal, but there was nothing else to do. By early morning, denial had worn thin. Calls were made that hadn't seemed necessary hours earlier. Local authorities listened carefully, asking measured questions that carried an undertone of seriousness. How old was she? What was she wearing? Where exactly had she planned to hike? Each answer anchored the situation further into reality. When the sun finally rose, it brought no relief. Light revealed nothing new, just the same quiet road, the same trees standing exactly where they had been the day before. Her car remained untouched, a silent confirmation that she hadn't returned during the night. The forest had kept her. The first deputies arrived with calm expressions trained by experience. They spoke gently, but their presence changed the air. This was no longer a private fear. It was something official now. Notes were taken. Radios crackled softly. A timeline began to form, marking her last known movements like a closing door. As word spread, neighbors and locals offered help almost instinctively. Some knew the trails well, others simply understood what it meant to lose someone to the land. Faces appeared with concern etched deep, carrying flashlights, water, and quiet resolve. The waiting began to shift shape. Still, beneath the coordination and careful planning, fear continued to grow. The longer she remained missing, the more the wilderness felt like an active force rather than a backdrop. Time was no longer neutral. It pressed forward, taking something with it every hour. No one said the worst possibilities aloud, but they hovered close, unspoken yet understood. Injuries, animals, weather, wrong turns, each thought arrived uninvited. Every delay felt like a choice being made by the world itself, one that did not favor her, one that demanded action before imagination could go any further or become unbearable by noon. The waiting was over. Fear had finished growing. And as the first searchers stepped toward the trees, the forest offered no reassurance at all. The search began without ceremony. Boots crossed from gravel to dirt, and voices instinctively dropped as if the forest required permission. Radios hissed softly, their sound swallowed almost immediately by trees that stood too close together. Light filtered unevenly through branches, breaking into fragments that shifted with every step. What looked manageable from the road quickly collapsed into confusion. Paths forked without warning. Landmarks vanished when turned away from. The forest did not announce danger, it simply rearranged itself. Each searcher felt it, the subtle disorientation, the sense that the land was neither hostile nor welcoming. It was indifferent, and that indifference carried weight. Names were called, carefully at first, then louder. Sound traveled strangely here, bending and fading, as if pulled downward into moss and soil before it could return. They moved in widening lines, eyes trained on the ground for anything unnatural. A broken branch. A scuffed stone. An imprint where a boot might have slipped. But the earth was soft with pine needles, forgiving in a way that erased evidence. The longer they looked, the more every mark seemed unreliable. Elk tracks crossed the trail, deep and clean, confusing the ground further. Someone paused to examine them, then shook their head. Too old. Too many. Not useful yet. Hope flickered briefly, then dimmed. The forest offered abundance, but no clarity. Every step forward felt like a guess, every decision a quiet gamble made against time. Hours passed unnoticed until fatigue crept in through the legs and shoulders. The terrain shifted constantly, rising and dropping without rhythm. Fallen trees forced detours. Thick underbrush slowed movement to a crawl. Water bottles emptied faster than expected. Radios crackled with updates that all sounded the same. Negative. Nothing here. No sign. The repetition began to wear down even the most determined voices. They tried to stay methodical, but emotion seeped through anyway. The idea that she could be anywhere within this vastness pressed against their focus, threatening to undo it. As midday approached, sunlight grew harsher but no warmer. Shadows sharpened, making every hollow seem deeper, every thicket more ominous. Someone found a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn and froze, heart racing, only to realize it was old, sun-bleached, unrelated. Disappointment landed hard, leaving behind guilt for feeling relief at all. The forest watched these small human reactions without response. It kept its own time, its own logic. Birds scattered overhead, startled by movement, then settled again as if nothing had happened. Command decisions grew heavier as the day wore on. Maps were consulted, lines adjusted, areas cleared and marked off. Progress was measured in effort, not results. The forest gave no confirmation, no feedback. It did not reward persistence or punish mistakes. It simply absorbed them. The lack of answers began to feel personal, as if the land itself had decided to remain silent. Faces tightened. Shoulders slumped. Still, no one suggested stopping. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in fully. Muscles ached, and attention drifted dangerously. Searchers were rotated out, replaced by others just beginning to understand how deceptive the terrain was. The realization spread quietly. If she had passed through here, the forest had already erased her trail. And if she was still moving, she was moving unseen. As the first day of searching ended without discovery, silence followed them back out of the trees, heavier than before, promising that tomorrow would demand even more and give nothing back easily. Morning returned without apology. The forest looked unchanged, almost gentle in the early light, as if it had not consumed an entire day of effort already. Searchers regrouped at the trailhead with tired eyes and stiff movements, drinking coffee that did little to soften the weight settling in their chests. Yesterday had answered nothing. Today had to answer something. Silence was no longer acceptable. The search perimeter expanded outward in calculated arcs. 7 miles became the new measure of hope, then fear. Maps filled with colored lines and handwritten notes, marking where boots had already pressed the ground flat. Experienced trackers joined quietly. Their presence felt more than announced. They studied terrain the way others read faces, noticing subtle shifts in soil, broken patterns, places where movement made sense and places where it didn't. Their calm contrasted sharply with the urgency beneath it. With each mile added, the reality of distance settled deeper. 7 miles in this terrain was not a straight line. It was elevation, detours, dead ends, and energy drained by uncertainty. The thought that she could have traveled this far alone, injured or disoriented, pressed against everyone's reasoning. Some believed she wouldn't have gone far. Others worried she had gone farther than anyone wanted to admit. Radios buzzed constantly now, fragments of updates overlapping. Crews leapfrogged forward, pushing into areas less traveled, where trails thinned into suggestion. The forest grew denser, darker, its floor uneven and deceptive. Elk sign appeared more frequently here, deep tracks cutting parallel lines through undergrowth. Again, they were noted, then dismissed. Animal movement was expected. Human movement was what they needed. By midday, exhaustion returned faster than before. Muscles remembered yesterday too well. Knees protested steep descents. Throats burned from calling her name into spaces that never replied. 7 miles began to feel like an accusation. If she wasn't within this expanding circle, where was she? And if she was, why hadn't she been found? Quiet doubts surfaced between steps. Someone mentioned weather patterns, the possibility of storms later in the week. Another calculated survival windows allowed, then stopped, realizing the damage numbers could do. Hope had become something fragile, carefully handled, passed from one person to the next without squeezing too hard. The forest offered no variation in response. No disturbed brush. No dropped gear. No sound that lingered longer than a heartbeat. Even the birds seemed to move differently now, lifting away before anyone could interpret their reactions. Every sense was stretched thin, alert for meaning that never arrived. Late afternoon brought a sobering realization. The farther the search extended, the more complicated coordination became. Resources thinned. Fatigue multiplied. Command decisions grew sharper, less forgiving. Some areas would have to wait. Some guesses would have to be made. Silence forced choices, and choices carried consequences. As the sun dipped lower, the search slowed, then paused. Crews checked in, voices heavy with disappointment. 7 miles of wilderness had given them nothing back. The land had not resisted. It had not cooperated. It had simply existed, unchanged by human concern. That indifference began to feel unbearable. Back at the staging area, plans were adjusted again. New sectors highlighted. Tomorrow's strategy discussed in quieter tones. The realization settled fully now. This was no longer a short search. Time had stretched into something dangerous. And somewhere beyond 7 miles of silence, the forest was still keeping her location to itself, waiting to see how far they were willing to go next. Alone was not a word she had expected to feel this heavy. At first, it had felt temporary, a pause between decisions, a moment to breathe and reorient. The forest had been quiet then, almost comforting, as if it would allow her to pass through without consequence. That illusion did not last. Somewhere beyond the 7 miles being measured and remapped, she sat pressed against a fallen log, trying to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. She remembered the moment she realized the trail was no longer where it should have been. A turn that felt right. A path that narrowed too suddenly. She had told herself it was nothing, that she could correct it easily. Confidence had carried her forward long after caution should have spoken louder. Now, with her ankle throbbing and her hands shaking from cold, she understood how small that mistake had been and how enormous its consequences were. Pain came in waves. When she stayed still, it dulled into something manageable. When she tried to move, it sharpened, stealing her breath and blurring her vision. She tested her weight carefully, biting down on her sleeve to keep from crying out. The forest did not care how quietly she suffered. It offered no comfort, only space. Too much of it. Hunger arrived next, subtle but persistent. She had packed lightly, assuming she would be back before it mattered. Now she counted what little she had left, stretching bites into rituals, swallowing slowly to trick her body into feeling full. Water was harder. She rationed carefully, terrified of the moment when the bottle would be empty and nothing nearby would look safe enough to drink. Night had been the worst. Darkness pressed in from every direction, thick and complete. Sounds multiplied without warning. Branches cracked. Something moved nearby, then disappeared. She wrapped herself tighter, pulling her knees to her chest, whispering reassurances she no longer believed. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by pain and fear and the constant question of whether anyone was looking for her yet. She tried to stay logical. She reminded herself of advice she'd heard before. Stay put. Make yourself visible. Conserve energy. But logic battled panic constantly. What if they never came this way? What if she was already outside the area they were searching? The thought tightened her chest until breathing felt like work. During the day, she forced herself to move short distances, hoping to find something familiar, anything that made sense. Trees blurred together. Slopes felt steeper than they looked. Every direction seemed plausible and wrong at the same time. She left small markers when she could, bent branches, scraped bark, gestures that felt meaningful even as doubt whispered they might never be seen. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Her kitchen at home. A laugh she'd dismissed that morning. The warmth of ordinary things she had never thought to miss. Those thoughts hurt more than the injury sometimes, because they reminded her of what she was losing minute by minute. She tried to imagine voices cutting through the trees, calling her name the way people always did in stories. She practiced answering, forcing her throat to remember how to be loud. When she shouted once, the sound felt thin and wrong, swallowed almost immediately. The silence afterward was worse, proof of how easily she could disappear here. Still, she promised herself she would answer if she heard anything at all. She would not stay silent. She would not let the forest decide everything for her. She shifted closer to the log, conserving warmth, watching the light fade, aware the coming storm would test every fragile plan she had made and wondering if anyone beyond the trees sensed the danger gathering overhead. Morning brought clouds instead of clarity. The air felt heavier, charged, as crews gathered again beneath a sky slowly sealing itself shut. Wind moved through the treetops in low, restless waves, carrying the smell of rain. Yesterday's silence had been exhausting. Today promised resistance. Weather reports confirmed what everyone could already feel. A system was moving in, cold and persistent, and it would not wait for anyone to be found. Rain began lightly, almost politely, just enough to darken soil and blur edges. Jackets came out. Hoods were pulled tight. Maps were rechecked with new urgency. Wet ground changed everything. Tracks dissolved. Sound carried differently. The forest grew slick and unpredictable, punishing careless steps. What little advantage daylight offered was slipping away behind thickening clouds. Search leaders weighed options carefully. Push forward and risk injuries, or slow down and lose precious time. Voices stayed controlled, but tension threaded through every exchange. No one wanted to say what bad weather meant for a girl already injured and exposed. The thought hovered unspoken, shaping every decision. By midday, rain turned steady, soaking through gloves and seams. Trails became streams. Small creeks swelled and spread, cutting off direct routes. The forest, already indifferent, now felt actively hostile. Searchers leaned into the climb, breathing hard, boots sliding on mud and slick roots. Radios crackled with warnings and location checks, the sound sharp against the muffled world. Visibility dropped quickly. Distant shapes blurred into shadow. Even familiar landmarks became unreliable. Someone slipped and caught themselves just in time, heart pounding. Another twisted an ankle and was escorted back, frustration etched deep. Each setback reminded them how thin the margin was. How easily the search itself could become another emergency. Somewhere beyond their reach, rain fell on bare skin and torn clothing. The idea gnawed at everyone, fueling both urgency and dread. Hypothermia was no longer an abstract possibility. It was a countdown. Calculations ran silently through tired minds, measuring hours against exposure, hope against reality. In brief lulls, voices rose again, calling her name into the rain. The sound barely traveled. It fell flat, absorbed by wet earth and dense foliage. The forest answered only with water dripping from leaves and the low groan of wind bending branches. It felt like shouting into a closed mouth. As afternoon faded, command made the call to pull teams back from the most dangerous sectors. It was the right decision. Everyone knew that. It still felt like surrender. Faces hardened as they turned back, every step away from the search line heavy with doubt. Rain followed them, relentless, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. Decisions made under pressure revealed quiet fractures between people who trusted each other. Fatigue sharpened tempers, softened patience, exposed fear that logic could not fully contain. Still, no one left. They checked each other's hands, adjusted straps, shared water, small acts of solidarity holding the line. Trust became survival, as important as equipment. The storm demanded cooperation, and in its shadow, human connection was tested just as harshly as endurance. No one knew yet how much that trust would matter, or how close they were to missing the one sign that could change everything entirely by morning light. Night approached early under the storm-dark sky. Rain showed no sign of stopping. Somewhere in the wilderness, endurance was being tested beyond design. As searchers prepared for another difficult day, an uneasy thought settled among them. If the forest would not speak, perhaps they needed to learn how to listen differently when morning came. Morning broke unevenly after the storm, clouds thinning but refusing to leave entirely. The forest smelled washed and raw, branches heavy with water, ground darkened and reshaped. Searchers moved more slowly now, aware that yesterday's rain had erased nearly everything they might have followed. What remained felt unfamiliar, subtly altered, as if the land had been rewritten overnight. It was during a routine sweep that the difference appeared. A tracker paused near a slope others had already crossed, crouching low, eyes narrowing. The marks were not obvious, not broken branches or human prints. They were patterns, shallow impressions pressed into mud at regular intervals, too clean to be random, too numerous to belong to one person. Elk trails. Fresh ones. They cut diagonally across the search line, leading away from known routes, threading through terrain no one had prioritized. At first, no one reacted. Animal sign was everywhere out here. But something about these tracks felt deliberate, persistent. The tracker followed them a few yards, then stopped, calling others over. Quiet gathered around the place as they studied the ground together. The trail curved where the land offered easiest passage, avoiding steep drops, skirting thick brush. It was efficient. Intentional. It went where a frightened, injured person might also choose without realizing it. Doubt surfaced immediately. Elk moved constantly. Following animals could waste time they did not have. But the tracker spoke carefully, explaining how these trails formed over days, sometimes weeks, shaped by instinct and survival. Animals chose paths that conserved energy, that led toward water and shelter. Humans, especially lost ones, often did the same unknowingly. The idea felt fragile, almost superstitious, yet impossible to ignore. Command weighed the suggestion. Maps were unfolded again, lines redrawn in pencil this time, tentative. The elk trail crossed out of the established grid, bending toward rougher ground. It led away from certainty, away from the comfort of procedure. Trusting it meant admitting that logic alone had failed so far. Silence hung while the decision formed. They followed. The forest shifted subtly as they moved along the animal path. Vegetation thinned in places, opening sightlines that hadn't existed elsewhere. The ground dipped toward low areas where water collected, then rose again onto ridges protected from wind. It felt different, purposeful, as if the land itself was guiding movement rather than resisting it. Radios quieted. Voices dropped. Everyone watched the ground more closely now, seeing it with new intent. The trail split and rejoined repeatedly, overlapping itself like memory. Some tracks were older, some sharp-edged, pressed deep by recent weight. The realization settled slowly. These animals had been moving through here during the storm, during the cold, choosing survival without hesitation. If she had been anywhere near this path, it might have carried her farther than she ever meant to go. Hours passed with renewed focus. Fatigue was still there, but it felt different, driven now by something close to belief. Someone found disturbed moss, then a bent sapling not shaped by hooves. It was subtle enough to be accidental, meaningful enough to stop everyone cold. No one spoke for several seconds. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them. As afternoon stretched on, the elk trail led deeper, toward terrain that hadn't been searched at all. Confidence warred with fear. Following the wrong sign now could cost everything. Yet turning back felt worse, like choosing ignorance over possibility. They pressed forward, step by careful step. Behind them, the old search lines faded into irrelevance. Ahead, the trail that didn't belong to her might be the only thing that did. And as the light shifted again, hope reshaped itself around a single unsettling question. What if the forest had been showing them the way all along, and they were only just beginning to understand where to look? The possibility lingered as evening approached, sharpening attention and unease. If they were right, everything changed. If they were wrong, they might be walking past her again. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next rise, the trail curved out of sight, carrying them toward answers that promised relief or deeper uncertainty. Morning would reveal whether instinct could succeed where structure had failed, and whether hope survived. Trust felt heavier than doubt as they moved deeper along the elk trail. Each step carried the weight of choice, the quiet fear that instinct might betray them now. Radios stayed mostly silent, not from discipline but unease. No one wanted to break whatever fragile logic was guiding their feet forward. The terrain worsened quickly. The trail dipped into ravines where water still pooled from the storm, then climbed sharply into rockier ground. Progress slowed to careful, deliberate movement. Every few minutes someone stopped, scanning for confirmation, something unmistakably human. Each pause ended the same way, with a nod and continued motion. Commitment replaced certainty. Behind them, structured search grids dissolved into memory. Ahead, the path twisted unpredictably, sometimes narrowing to nothing, sometimes widening where animals had passed repeatedly. Doubt resurfaced in waves. Elk could lead anywhere. Elk did not bleed, did not panic, did not need rescue. Following them felt dangerously close to surrendering control. Arguments stayed muted but present. One voice questioned the risk, another defended the logic. Command weighed distance against daylight, weather against fatigue. If this was wrong, they were burning hours they could not recover. If it was right, turning back might erase their only chance. The forest offered no guidance beyond the ground beneath their boots. Midday passed unnoticed. Hunger was ignored. Muscles protested but were overridden. Someone nearly fell crossing slick stone, caught just in time by another's grip. The moment lingered, a reminder that trust now extended beyond ideas into physical survival. They moved on closer together. The trail split again near a dense stand of trees. One branch descended sharply, the other curved upward along a ridge. The elk sign favored the descent. Water, shelter, efficiency. Human logic hesitated. Injured people avoided steep drops when possible. Or did they? Pain changed choices. Fear narrowed options. No one could be sure. They chose the descent. The forest closed in as elevation dropped. Light dimmed under thick canopy. Sound flattened, making it impossible to judge distance. Every snapped twig raised hearts. Every shadow suggested form. Someone whispered her name once, then stopped, ashamed of hope without evidence. Time stretched thin. Radios crackled with a check-in from a distant team, reporting nothing new. The gap between searchers widened dangerously, not in space but in belief. Confidence eroded quietly, grain by grain. The possibility settled that they were following the wrong path after all. Then they found nothing. No sign. No disturbance. Just untouched forest continuing endlessly forward. The elk trail began to scatter, prints overlapping until direction blurred. The sense of momentum collapsed. Stopping felt inevitable and unbearable. Command called for a pause. Water was past. Maps unfolded again, damp and creased. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. No one wanted to say it. This could be failure repeating itself in a new shape. As they stood there, weighing retreat against stubborn persistence, a tracker crouched again, eyes locked on the ground. Not the elk sign this time, but something smaller, almost erased. A scuff. A broken stem bent at an unnatural angle. It was barely there, fragile as doubt itself. No one celebrated. No one spoke. They leaned closer, breath held. If this was imagination, they were lost. If it was real, they had nearly walked past her again. Decision loomed sharper now, balanced on something that could disappear with one careless step. They marked the spot carefully and adjusted direction by inches. The wrong path might still become the right one, but only if they were willing to trust the smallest evidence left behind. And somewhere ahead, unseen and unmoving, the consequences of that choice were waiting. They did not know it yet, but the land ahead held both shelter and pain, and the next decision would carry them beyond doubt, toward either revelation or regret, into a search that would finally begin to narrow instead of expand there. Endurance became a quiet, grinding task measured in breaths rather than hours. She no longer remembered when the pain had shifted from sharp to constant, only that it was always there now, humming beneath every thought. Her ankle had swollen grotesquely, skin stretched tight and hot, and she avoided looking at it for long. Looking made it feel permanent. She had moved less with each passing day. What began as short, careful attempts to relocate had narrowed into survival within a shrinking circle. The log became shelter. The shallow dip in the ground became protection from wind. Rainwater collected in leaves became precious. She learned the forest in fragments, not as a whole place but as a series of immediate problems that demanded solutions. Cold was the hardest to escape. Even when the rain stopped, dampness clung to her clothes and skin. Shivering drained energy she could not afford to lose. She layered everything she had, then curled inward, making herself smaller, as if that could reduce the space fear occupied inside her. Nights blurred together, marked only by exhaustion and brief, disjointed sleep. Hunger sharpened her thoughts in cruel ways. She imagined food vividly, smells and textures arriving uninvited. Her body felt lighter, weaker, as if something essential was being quietly taken away. When she stood, darkness crowded the edges of her vision. She learned to sit back down quickly, to respect the warning signs before they turned into collapse. Injuries multiplied subtly. Scratches festered. Muscles stiffened from lack of movement. She noticed her hands shaking even when she was warm enough. Infection became a word she tried not to think about, even as redness crept outward. Her body was fighting a battle she could barely support anymore. Thoughts lost their linear shape. Memories surfaced out of order, overlapping with imagined conversations. At times she was certain she heard voices calling, close enough to answer. When she called back and heard nothing, the disappointment cut deeper than silence ever had. Doubt began to whisper that rescue might already have come and gone without her noticing. She forced herself to stay conscious during daylight, afraid of sleeping through something important. Every sound became significant. Wind, water, movement. Her focus narrowed dangerously, locking onto hope with a desperation that bordered on hallucination. She repeated her name aloud, grounding herself in something real, something she could still claim. Pain returned in waves, sometimes so strong it brought tears she no longer had the energy to wipe away. She bargained silently with no one in particular, promising caution, promising gratitude, promising anything if she could just be seen. The forest remained unmoved, but she continued anyway. Giving up felt heavier than enduring. As the days stretched on, despair and determination tangled together. She imagined her family, not as they were now, but as they had been, unchanged and waiting. That image hurt, but it also anchored her. It gave her a reason to wake up, to adjust her position toward what little light filtered through the trees. By the time her strength began to fail completely, she no longer expected rescue. She only hoped she had left enough of herself behind to be found. Somewhere beyond the trees, people were closing in, following signs she could not see. And as her consciousness wavered, the smallest disturbance nearby hinted that endurance might soon meet consequence, one way or another. She tried to prepare herself for either outcome, though preparation felt like pretending. Her breathing grew shallow, measured, as if conserving air itself might matter. The forest seemed closer now, pressing in, not threatening but final. She pressed her fingers into the soil, grounding herself in its cool firmness, whispering that she was still here. Even as strength drained away, awareness lingered stubbornly, refusing to let go completely. Somewhere, something was moving differently, closer than before. She could not see it, could not be sure it was real, but the change felt undeniable. Whatever came next would not be another empty night. It would be an answer. The waiting, the pain, the silence were reaching a breaking point, and the forest was about to reveal whether endurance had been enough, or only delayed the inevitable. They did not see her at first. The forest looked the same as it had for days, dense and unremarkable. Searchers moved slowly, eyes scanning ground already judged empty. Fatigue dulled reactions, and hope felt almost irresponsible. Then someone stopped. It was not a shout or sudden certainty, just a hesitation that spread. A shape lay near the base of a tree, partially hidden by brush. For a moment, no one breathed. They approached carefully, afraid of what confirmation might mean. She was smaller than expected, folded inward, unmoving. Recognition came before relief. Someone whispered her name, voice breaking. When her chest rose faintly, the moment shattered. Movement erupted, controlled chaos replacing stunned silence. Medics pushed forward, packs dropped, radios crackling urgently. She did not respond when touched, her skin cold and damp. Breathing was shallow but present, fragile as glass. They stabilized her where she lay, afraid to move her too quickly. Injuries revealed themselves piece by piece. The swollen ankle, infected cuts, signs of prolonged exposure. Each detail told a story no one wanted to imagine fully. She murmured once, barely audible, a sound more than a word. Someone answered her immediately, promising she was safe. The lie was necessary. Extraction took time, careful and agonizing. A stretcher was assembled, straps adjusted around her gently. Rain threatened again, clouds gathering as if resentful. When they lifted her, she groaned, pain cutting through haze. No one spoke except to reassure her constantly. The forest seemed to close behind them as they moved away. Hours blurred as they navigated difficult ground back toward access. Every step felt like defiance. By the time they reached the waiting vehicle, dusk was falling. Hands trembled as doors closed and heat surrounded her. Only then did relief finally surface, sharp and overwhelming. She had been found where no one had expected her to be. The elk trail had led them beyond logic and procedure. As the vehicle pulled away, radios carried the news outward. Celebration remained muted, tempered by the severity of her condition. Survival was not victory yet, only possibility. Behind them, the forest returned to stillness. Ahead waited hospitals, questions, and consequences that would unfold slowly. For now, All that mattered was that she was alive. Yet endurance had left its mark, deeper than anyone could see. As sirens began their distant call, silence followed again. The search was over, but the story was not. What she endured would soon surface in fragments and scars. Recovery would demand answers the wilderness never gave freely. As night settled once more, a different kind of waiting began. Those who found her carried relief mixed with quiet guilt. They wondered how close they had come to failure. The question lingered without answer, heavy and unresolved. Inside the vehicle, she drifted in and out of awareness. Hands held hers, anchoring her to the present. Pain followed her even here, insistent and unforgiving. But warmth returned, slowly reclaiming ground cold had stolen. Outside, darkness erased the path that had led them there. The elk trails vanished again into anonymity. They would become a story told later, almost unbelievable. For now, the focus narrowed to breathing and time. Minutes mattered more than explanations. The forest had released her, but not without cost. Ahead waited recovery rooms and long nights of remembering. The rescue marked an end and a beginning intertwined. As lights faded behind them, uncertainty shifted shape. The search for her was finished. The search for understanding was only just starting. In the coming days, details would emerge slowly and painfully. Each revelation would challenge the relief they felt now. Survival carried obligations as heavy as gratitude. No one yet understood how close she had come to disappearing. The forest kept that knowledge, indifferent as ever. As the road unwound beneath the tires, night fully claimed the sky. Somewhere behind them, silence settled again among the trees. Ahead, questions waited patiently for answers no one was ready to give. The rescue had changed everything, but nothing was finished. What came next would be quieter, slower, and just as difficult. As they drove on, the weight of survival followed them. It lingered in silence, in memory, and in the girl's fragile breathing. This ending was not peace, only pause. Ahead waited the reckoning of recovery, where survival would be tested again. The forest had let her go. Now she would have to find her way back to herself, in ways no one expected. After the wilderness let her go, time slowed into careful increments. Hospital lights replaced filtered sun, steady beeps replaced wind. Warmth returned unevenly, reclaiming fingers and toes first, then deeper places that had felt unreachable. Doctors spoke in measured tones, naming injuries and possibilities. Family stood close, learning how to breathe again without fear breaking each inhale. Survival, it turned out, was not a single moment but a series of fragile permissions granted by the body. She woke and slept in cycles, awareness drifting like fog. When she opened her eyes, faces hovered with practiced calm and poorly hidden relief. She tried to speak and found her throat raw, words reduced to nods and faint sounds. Pain persisted, but it was different now, structured, addressed. Bandages made sense of wounds the forest had left chaotic. Still, the smell of antiseptic could not erase the memory of wet earth pressed into her palms. Questions arrived gently at first. What did you remember? Where did you go? She answered in fragments, describing choices that felt ordinary until they weren't. A turn taken because it looked right. A slope descended because it promised shelter. Listeners wrote carefully, aware that recollection was brittle, shaped by fear and fatigue. Some details refused to surface. Others arrived uninvited at night, sharp and vivid, leaving her shaking until dawn. Recovery demanded patience she did not yet possess. Physical therapy hurt in ways painkillers could not touch, reintroducing movement to joints that had learned stillness. Each step felt like negotiating with memory. Progress was measured and celebrated, then followed by setbacks that stole confidence. She learned to accept help, to trust hands that steadied her without judgment. Independence, once effortless, became a goal rather than a given. Those who searched visited when they could. Conversations stayed quiet, respectful. Gratitude passed both ways, complicated and sincere. They spoke of elk trails and instincts, of a moment when doubt nearly turned them back. She listened, absorbing the idea that survival had been collaborative, shaped by choices made far beyond her sight. Guilt surfaced unexpectedly, heavy and irrational. She worked to set it down. Outside the hospital, the story took shape. Headlines simplified. Timelines sharpened. The wilderness became a character again, dramatic and dangerous. She watched from a distance, unsure where she fit within the narrative others told. What she knew was smaller and more personal: the sound of rain on leaves, the weight of waiting, the thin line between effort and surrender. Those truths resisted easy framing. When she finally returned home, the world felt louder. Familiar rooms carried new shadows. Ordinary noises startled her awake. She learned that survival left echoes, and that healing meant meeting them without retreat. Counseling helped name the invisible injuries. Support arrived in uneven waves, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes absent. She practiced balance, learning when to engage and when to rest. The forest lingered in dreams, not as threat but as presence. Over time, its edges softened. She could remember beauty again without flinching. She understood that nature had not chosen her suffering, nor her rescue. It had simply been itself. Accepting that brought a quiet kind of peace, earned slowly. She marked progress with small rituals, milestones unnoticed by others. The first night without alarms. The first shower without fear. The first laugh that arrived unforced and stayed. Each sign mattered. Each reminded her that recovery moved forward even when it felt stalled. She kept a journal, not to dramatize pain, but to track ordinary returns: appetite, curiosity, sleep. Writing steadied her when memory blurred. It offered proof that endurance could transform into living, that survival could widen into something gentler and sustainable. She learned to ask for time, to forgive delays, and to believe that healing, like trails, curves before it straightens again. Always forward, never alone. In the end, the story settled into something less dramatic and more enduring. A girl vanished and was found. Community listened differently. Trails were reimagined. The forest remained. And she learned that being found did not mean being finished. It meant beginning again, with care, with memory, and with a respect for silence that would guide her steps long after the cameras turned away.